Hey folks, so I make no secret of the fact that I'm a communist, a Leninist specifically, and I'm heavily influenced in my thought by Ho Chi Minh thought, which, to briefly summarize, prioritizes the cultural and national liberation goals of socialism over economic goals, which are not unimportant, but generally favor a social market economy because the economic conditions for a pure socialism transitioning to full communism just aren't on the ground yet, and we're probably about 20 years off from those economic conditions. So we are not uninterested with economics, but we are primarily interested in the cultural aspect. So my position regarding the cultural aspect is that working class culture in the West is under siege from the managerial bourgeoisie, especially through like cultural liberalism. So, yes, I'm a communist who thinks liberals are a bigger threat to the working class than conservatives. I know that some of you might have had your minds explode there a little bit because you've been conditioned to think that liberals and communists are the same thing, but we are very much not. Now, I'm ashamed to admit it, but I was once a right wing libertarian and eventually an anarcho capitalist. I was a libertarian all the way through undergrad, in fact. I was a member of the Libertarian Club. It was actually working for a living after college and before grad school that made me a communist. I learned firsthand how much capitalism sucks, and that made me not a capitalist anymore. That said, I do want to talk about Ayn Rand, and more specifically her novel Anthem. Uh, I was a junior in high school when that teen dystopia genre just started to get going. I was probably in college when it got really big with like the Hunger Games and stuff. I went on a bit of a classical dystopia bender. I read all these classics, Brave New World, 1984, Thomas More's Utopia, and of course, Anthem. In fact, this was the copy I read back then. Anthem was and remains my favorite of the classical works of dystopia. At that time, I was already sort of right libertarian leaning, but reading Anthem really helped me become conscious of my libertarianism. And even though, today as a communist, I think Anthem is perhaps the most challenging to my worldview of all of those utopias. Like 1984 is completely ridiculous, right? It presents Soviet authoritarianism as sort of having been for its own sake or for the greater glory of social control or some kind of fetish. But that completely ignores the historical conditions that led to the authoritarian state in the Soviet Union, namely the constant, imminent threat of invasion, both from the United States and then from fascism. So, 1984 is just an absurd straw man of communism. It's beneath serious consideration. But Anthem is different. Anthem asks if we, as communists, are conceding our individuality in our desire for collective action and collective identity. I think that is a fair question, and I think it deserves a fair response. So, for me, and for most Leninists I know, no. My personal interests line up with my class interests. So when capitalists try to oppress all members of a group that I'm part of, they're necessarily trying to oppress me, and in trying to throw off the yoke of my own personal oppression, I can do that more effectively by removing those same constraints from everyone. And here's I think the real twist, right? Even though I'm not a right libertarian anymore, I am still an egoist. Egoism does not imply capitalism. Capitalism is not a necessary consequence of egoism. In fact, one of the other great egoist philosophers, Max Stirner, held to left wing anarchist positions. And I don't see any inherent conflict between being a communist, a Leninist, and being an egoist. I find that I am optimizing my self interest by advancing my class interest, which is an interest I have. Uh, So what I'd like to do is I'd like to spend the rest of this video defending my version of egoism, which I call meta-ethical egoism. I think it sidesteps some of the objections, the prisoner's dilemma objections, and a truly stupid argument advanced by James Rachels that the distinction between self and others is arbitrary. Like, apparently he's never heard of the problem of other minds. But my formulation renders sort of all of that irrelevant. So if you'll pardon me and give me a moment to switch over to screen capture view, uh, I'll rigorously defend my position. Warning, lots of formal logic ahead. So let's start by defining egoism, and this will help us to define our position further. The psychological egoism is the position that people operate primarily or exclusively out of self-interest, while rational egoism holds that it is rational to act according to one's self-interest, while ethical egoism holds that it is morally good to act out of one's self-interest, and meta-ethical egoism, or MEE, the position I am defending and defining here, is that moral statements which are contrary to one's self-interest are incoherent and categorically false. So let's just take a quick review of meta-ethics so we can properly define MEE. So meta-ethics is a branch of ethics sort of situated between descriptive ethics, what do people think is right and wrong and why, and normative ethics, which asks what actually is right and wrong. So meta-ethics concerns the meaning and logic of moral language. So the first question that any good meta-ethical discussion would ask is, are moral statements propositions? Can they be evaluated as true or false? So considering the statement, murder is wrong, is that something that can be true or false, or is it something else? So non-cognitivists will say no. The classic non-cognitivist position is emotivism. Murder is wrong just means boo murder, or I don't like murder. It's an emotional reaction. It can't be true or false. It just is. But for cognitivists, cognitivists say yes, murder is wrong, can either be true or false. So the next question becomes for cognitivists, okay, well, how do you define these moral propositions and how do you evaluate them? And there's really two responses to this. One is a realist position and the other is a relativist position. So for cognitive realists, moral propositions make reference to objective moral facts and are evaluated according to those facts. So for a meta-ethical objectivist, moral propositions refer to objective moral facts, either innate moral facts or moral facts that are derived from non-moral facts, and we evaluate them by looking at the moral facts. Cognitive nihilism, or error theory, because there are non-cognitivist versions of nihilism, agree that moral propositions reference objective moral facts, but would say that objective moral facts in and of themselves are completely incoherent, and therefore there are no objective moral facts, and so all moral statements are categorically false. Murder is wrong is categorically false. Murder is right is categorically false. It's all categorically false. For the relativist, on the other hand, propositions are evaluated relative to the value judgments of agents. So in personal relativism, it's a matter of the extent to which you agree with the proposition. So murder is bad could be true for you if you agree that murder is bad. Personal relativism is sometimes conflated with emotivism, which it's different from because it's cognitivist, and it's conflated often with egoism. But egoism is about self-interest, not beliefs. So a relativist will ask, do you think murder is bad? Whereas an egoist would ask, is murder in your self-interest? Cultural relativism, perhaps a little bit more common than personal relativism, holds that it's about the consensus judgment of a culture. So murder is bad is true in societies that hold that murder is bad. Now, despite the amount of press that personal and cultural relativism get, they're not actually widely held. But observer relativism is pretty widely held, and it's probably one of the oldest moral theories out there, going back to classic Indo-European civilization at least. So this says that a moral proposition like murder is bad is true or false for everybody relative to the moral judgments of a real or imagined observer. So sometimes we're talking about an ideal observer. Sometimes we're talking about a specific observer, like what would the Buddha do or what would Jesus do. And other times we're talking about some kind of deity. So divine command theory. What does God think about murder? is how we would evaluate that statement. And it's interesting because especially Protestant Christians love to kvetch about the lack of objective morality, when in fact, when you poke their positions, tend to come out observer relativism. So, with all of that defined now, we can begin to come up with a formal definition for metaethical egoism. So, metaethical egoism holds that normative statements represent propositions, so we're cognitivist, and that moral statements represent objective facts about goals and agents, so we are also a realist position. Normative statements which are consistent with the personal goals of the agent may be true, but where normative statements conflict with the agent's personal goals, they are categorically false. I think an immediate example might be helpful here. So, in plain terms, Tommy should be vegan is a proposition that can be true or false. Tommy should be vegan really means Tommy has some goal for which being vegan is necessary. And if Tommy has this goal, it might be true that Tommy should be vegan. However, if Tommy does not want to be vegan, then we know immediately that Tommy should be vegan is false. So let's get a little formal. For defining the ought to do X, let's say person A ought to do X, really means person A has some goal Z, such that X is a necessary condition for Z. So goal A, Z, and Z implies X. Now, if we want to say person A ought not to do X, we can say person X has some goal Z, such that X is a sufficient condition for, let's say, not Z. So A goal Z and X implies not Z. So we might immediately notice that these two are not actually contradicting each other, either in their formal conditions or their statements. So murder is good and murder is bad are not formal contradictions, even if they might be semantically. And in order to get over that, we are going to have to add some axioms to this if we want that to be a formal contradiction. But note that, like, A ought to do X is formally contradicted by it is not the case that A ought to do X. So it's going to depend on the ability to imply that negation of the whole condition from the negation of this part. But before we leave this, I want to talk just briefly about what it would mean to have a universal morality. So a statement like all people should do X is true if and only if there is some goal gamma such that for all people have that goal gamma, and gamma implies X. So this would be falsified. So universal morality is falsified if we can find either a single person who does not have goal gamma, or we can find a way to falsify this half. So, now, my true logic nerd friends out there might be bursting a blood vessel in how sloppily I've defined this. And that's basically because the model theory for predicate calculus is a convoluted mess. So what I'm doing here is I'm expressing propositions using predicate calculus, but I'm evaluating them using propositional calculus. And in order to make some of that stuff work, I'm going to have to use some of these axioms. But before we talk about that axiom, let's talk about this lemma. A implies not B is equal to B implies not A. That is just the contrapositive in the specific case. These are kind of necessary to make those explicit contradictions that we were talking about last slide. So I take as an axiom that if person A has goal not G, then person A does not have goal G. And slightly more controversially, I take it as if person A has goal Z and Z implies X, then A has goal X, which is self-necessary. Like, this is a tautology, it's just there for formal purposes. Okay, so now that we've discussed the logic, let's start considering what it means for something to be in conflict with my goals. So I generally think there are three instances where there's a conflict between an agent's goals and a normative statement. The first case is that I think it's not the case that I have goal Z. The second case is I have goal not Z. And the third case is I have contradictory goals. So I have goals Y and I have goals Z, but Y and Z together imply a contradiction. So to use the veganism example, these three cases would be: it's not the case that I have any desires for which being vegan is necessary. I hate vegans. I want to eat tasty animals right now. And I have a goal for which being vegan is necessary, and I want to eat tasty animals right now. So let's take a look at this first case, and we're going to do it with a neat semantic proof. So, setting up our truth conditions and the fact that it is not my goal is a very simple, straightforward contradiction proof by truth table. I won't be busting out the truth table again. Just generally note that every time we have goal AZ and not goal AZ, we'll have a formal contradiction. So in the second case, I hate vegans. Again, we have this case, and we can use Axiom 1 to rearrange that. And we have now a formal contradiction between goal AZ and not goal AZ, which leads to a contradiction, which would, again, bring us back here. So in the case that I have the opposite goal, I'm still justified in rejecting it and saying it's false. I should not be vegan. And case 3 is our most complicated case, where we're going to bring in our lemma and both of our axioms. So I have goal Z, and I have goal Y, and Z implies X, and Y implies not X. So we can use our lemma to rearrange this way, and you'll note that this now satisfies both the formal conditions for person A should do X and person A should not do X. And these are both true, even though we might think it's a contradiction, but again, there is no formal contradiction. But if we add axiom 2 first, and we add axiom 1 now, we get goal AX and not goal AX. So we are back to our formal contradiction conditions, and thus we have a contradiction in these terms. So if we accept axioms 1 and 2, then in the case where I need to be vegan but I hate vegans, I also end up with a contradiction. And so, just to wrap up then, in this case it's false that I should be a vegan, in this case it's false that I should be vegan, and in this case it's false that I should be vegan. So, summing up then, metaethical egoism is a cognitivist, realist metaethical account. It's not a claim that one ought to do what's in one's self-interest, but rather that it's incoherent to suggest that one ought to act contrary to one's self-interests. It literally leads to a contradiction in the truth conditions. And so, because it doesn't recommend what you should do, it just tells you that you can't be compelled to do what you don't want to do, it doesn't provide us with any guidance on prisoners' dilemmas or tragedies of the commons, so these are just irrelevant objections. And it provides a distinction between the self and others, where your goal conflicts with the goals of others. It's just not true. And finally, I think this is what would make Max Stirner proud, is that this position is still completely compatible with cognitive nihilism, because it's still possible for all normative statements compatible with one's self-interest to be false. And so it may be that all normative statements are false, and I personally have a leaning toward a nihilist interpretation. So that's it for this time. Thank you for listening to my long logic rant. I'll see you later, comrades. Bye.